Hi, I'm Tom on a Budget and welcome to my in-depth review of Malaysia's answer to Honda's CT125, a motorbike with a really long name, the Aveta Ranger Max Explorer. In this video I'll be focusing on this bike's use as a mini adventure bike in Southeast Asia, doing some comparisons to the CT125 and the Honda Wave that I own, looking at what Aveta have done right with this model, and I won't be holding back on this motorbike's shortcomings either. Aveta was founded in 2018 in Malaysia, specializing in small motorcycles. During that time, they launched an astonishing 11 models. That's remarkable once you consider that they came up with these models, engineered and built them in a time during which the world got distracted by fighting over toilet paper. This was also the time during which Honda continued their quest of re-releasing all of their small bikes from the distant past by putting them through a reverse shrink ray, adding a bit of bling and the 125cc engine of their Wave series. And one of the most desired bikes of that bunch had been the CT125 or the Hunter Cup, which came out in 2020. Now, for reasons that are only known to the Honda execs, they looked at Malaysia, a country that's crazy about small motorbikes, motorbike adventures, and a country that has got plenty of trails to explore, and decided to just ignore it. So this presented a golden opportunity for Aveta, which they took by launching the Ranger series of trail bikes. All they had to do was take the formula of the Hunter Cup, see what's great, and add their own flair. And well, I guess Aveta could make their mind up, as they launched 3 models in the Ranger series, with the Ranger Max Explorer being the youngest and the most premium member of that family. In his Hayabusa video, RCR referred to Suzukis of the 1990s as discount Hondas. Aveta seemed to be aspiring to that kind of mold. They also do the Kawasaki thing, where they will one-up the equivalent Honda model with some specifications, like 127cc instead of 125, because more is better. All that at a very competitive 7,000 Malaysian ringgit, or about 2,250 Australian dollar reduce, or 1,500 American greenbacks, which is a bit cheaper than a similar Wave 125i, or about 70% cheaper than ACT125, which goes for about 2,500 US dollars in Thailand. And for the price you pay, it actually is quite loaded with equipment. So this comes with a really bright LED light and a skid plate, a central rack between your legs so you can mount a backpack, a big 8-liter fuel tank, front luggage rack as well, a built-in USB charger since we've all got phones, tires and rims that in my opinion are actually more suitable for trail riding than the ones on the CT125, gas shocks, and like to see in CT125, it comes with a single seat for the rider, which makes it a bit easier to fill up, and a very sturdy rack right behind it that comes pre-fitted with a cushion for a passenger and foot pegs mounted on the frame where they belong. I mean, yes, I get nostalgia, but Honda, who looked at the swing arm of the CT125 and decided, yes, this is the exact location where we're going to install the foot pegs for maximum passenger comfort? Just imagine your feet bouncing up and down as you're blasting down a dirt road. And after that little tangent, the Ranger sounds pretty good, at least specs-wise, but the devil is in the detail. While beauty may be in the eye of the beholder, you cannot deny that this does stand out quite a bit, especially in that sun gold yellow. It does attract quite a bit of attention, which is often followed by thumbs pointing at the sky, phones pointing at the bike, and when arriving at a new location, it's not uncommon to have curious individuals doing laps around it, trying to figure out what that is. The frame is put together utilizing a fairly innovative double tubular design, which should give it a rigidity advantage compared to any of the air-cooled Honda Cups. Add to that a triple clamp for the bottom and the top of the forks, plus a heavily overbuilt rear swing arm, and the end result is actually a bike that feels really solid, way more so than any of the air-cooled Waves like the Wave 110 or the Wave 125 that I have myself. I definitely have to give my props to the Aveta engineers for the seating position. I'm 1.80 m and find this actually quite comfortable. I've recently had the displeasure of trying out a couple automatic scooters and a dirt bike where my feet were in this weird fetal position because they were quite high up. On here, they managed to give you a nice seating position with a really low seat, which short riders are going to appreciate quite a lot. The praise almost continues with the handlebars, where the design is good but the implementation is a bit wonky, because these handlebars have a bit of a twist to them to the left, as if it had been in a crash, even though we have never dropped it. But the design, as I said, is really good, which puts you into a nicely upright seating position, giving you good control while seated and even standing up. And even though the turning circle is quite limited, I'll have to say it's one of the very few bikes where I don't have to take my feet out of the way to turn in. So one thing they've copied from BYD and from modern Chinese vehicles is the tech. So this comes with a really nice dashboard, which has got some cool animations and shows you actually most of the stuff you're interested in, including a gear indicator. Thank you so very much. Going away from the dash, things go downhill a little bit with the switchgear that feels like it actually is from the 1980s, especially that accelerator, which is a bit loosey-goosey and you can't tighten that up properly. The brakes, they're okay. The mirrors, they're mostly fine. You do have to yank on them quite hard to adjust them. So if you want to adjust them, you have to put a bit of force on them. The one on the right, for some reason, vibrates quite heavily at about 6,000 RPM. So when you're just about cruising. Going a bit further back, that luggage rack is really, really nice. I love it. But again, just shows a bit of a lack of quality where these rubber stoppers here, they have both already fallen out. At least I had the foresight to put a drainage hole down here, so any liquid that comes in here drains out quite nice. Something that's purely cosmetic is the paint on the rack in the front and in the rear, which is really sensitive to getting scuffed up. So once you start carrying any luggage on that, that tends to look a bit sad over time, unfortunately. The USB charger in here was not plugged in internally, so it didn't do anything when we just started off. There were a couple loose bolts all around the engine that we had tightened up when we bought the bike. Some of it is excusable. Even on my Honda Wave, they had forgotten to tighten down a couple bolts for the foot pegs, which on this bike, thank you, they fold. I love that. Continuing with minor niggles maybe was the headlight, which is actually really good. It's a very, very bright light. However, it needed some adjustment because it was blinding everyone when it came from the factory. It just loosened this bolt and then pointed down. An assembly problem that's actually dangerous would be familiar to Harley riders and some sports bike riders as the Death Wobble, or some call it tank slapper, where the handlebars start to violently shake left and right at high speed. This bike did that at about 75 to 80 kilometers an hour. Commonly, this is the result of not having enough weight over the front wheel, i.e. if you've got too much weight in the back, if you're doing wheelies, or if your suspension isn't set up properly. After we tried to rectify it by moving weight around, we still couldn't properly solve it. So we brought it to a suspension specialist who opened up the forks and looked inside. In there he noticed that the springs were an uneven length, causing them to compress differently, which means every time you pressed it down, it would slightly twist the wheel, which would cause it also to rotate a bit. And whenever it went back up again, it would go the other way, which was causing that oscillation. He ended up replacing the springs internally, which completely solved the problem. The engine looks very similar to a lot of Honda designs, although the starter is sitting at the bottom, not at the top as you would usually expect. It's got an unusual 127cc, which is, oh my god, it's two more than 125, but it is a little bit odd. The reason I'm saying that is because Aveta wants to enter other markets outside of Malaysia, and in some of these markets you do have some advantages by staying below 125cc. These advantages are usually tax breaks, where you pay less insurance, less taxes. In Japan, for instance, 125cc bikes are allowed to go on some toll-free roads, like under bridges, to get to locations that bigger bikes would have to go on the expensive toll road. In Thailand, you pay less if you want to ship your motorbike. If it's sub 125cc, you pay less if you put it on a train. I would certainly be interested to hear from Malaysians if they see an advantage in having those extra 2cc's. The overall power output feels closer to something like 110cc, not a 125cc Honda. It's delivered to the wheels through a 4-speed semi-automatic gearbox, which is using the Asian rotary pattern that is lovely because you can go from 4th gear into neutral at a traffic light, not while you're moving, and the other way around if you want to bump start it. Since it's focused for trail riding, the gearing is quite low, which allows you to tractor up some pretty steep inclines. However, when you're riding it on the street, it can feel a little bit low, so it does feel a bit buzzy or revvy at about 70-75 actual kilometers an hour. It's hard to judge the actual top speed. It's listed at about 90 kilometers an hour, which seems about accurate. The reason why I'm saying I can't say it for sure is because I've struggled to read my phone screen on this here, and I cannot trust the odometer because it's telling me I'm doing 100 when I'm only doing about 80. I'd love to see a dyno chart of this engine, how the torque and power output is, because my butt dyno tells me it's kind of all over the place, with it pulling off really hard, then hitting a flat spot at 4,500 RPM and then picking up again a little bit higher up. As I said, it's a bit hard to say, and it's not helped by that piece of art that sits in here, the carburetor. I've never liked them, and this bike is reminding me why. When it comes to reliability, I have been really spoiled by Hondas, and while the suspension was terrible, we solved that, and the carburetor is being a pain in the neck, at least the engine internals, touch wood, in the 5,000 kilometers we owned it, have never given us any problems. One positive is that this bike has never consumed any oil, even though some of these air-cooled engines, even Honda sometimes can use some when doing prolonged highway hours, which we have done on this bike. Which leads me to the oil sump. Here Aveta have had some pretty good decisions and some pretty terrible ones at the same time. Let's start with the oil filtration, which is the same as on the cheap Honda Waves, which means it's got a spinner inside that needs to be serviced, I think, every 10,000 or 12,000 kilometers, which I would have preferred to just be a filter you can take off, because now this housing has to come off, this has to come off, this has to come off, and a whole bunch of other parts just to do a basic service item that would otherwise be quick filter. One advantage at least this has is it's got longer service intervals than a filter, because I wouldn't even know where to source a filter while I'm here in Thailand. Something Aveta have done better and worse than Honda is the 1.2 liter oil sump capacity. It's lovely that it's more than the measly 800 milliliters, and it just gives you a bit more oil. However, a lot of dealerships only stock 1 liter oil bottles, so if you get it refilled and you go to a dealer that knows what they're doing, they'll give you a half-empty bottle at the end, or they have to throw it out, or you have to pay for both. If you go to some dealers that don't know that this takes 1.2 liters because they're all used to Hondas, including some Aveta dealers, they might underfill it quite significantly, and checking the oil is pretty crucial after you've done a service, just in case a dealer has forgotten to fill it up. Checking the oil is unnecessary annoying because the dipstick that is here, it's nice and long, is a royal pain in the neck to get access to, because it is just under that hot part of the exhaust. And now that I've literally touched the exhaust, let's talk about it. I never thought that I would have a rant about a factory fitted exhaust, because this thing here has got a couple terrible design ideas that it must have gotten from enthusiasts. The base layout is well thought of initially, because it's an upswept design similar to the CT and the Monkey, which gives you a bit more clearance because the exhaust doesn't go as far down. That's cool, and in theory it should also allow for more wading depth because the exhaust doesn't get flooded in as you go into water. A low exhaust doesn't necessarily stop you from going through deep water, just keep the revs up and it's fine. With the CT125, you've got the air intake up in the luggage carrier up in here, and the exhaust just a little bit below it. So the exhaust starts to warn you, or your butt gets wet, that you're starting to get a little bit too low. On my Wave, the air intake is up in here. On this bike, this is the airbox, and the snorkel goes down there. So be really careful if you're going through deep water, because that engine will drown well before you start hearing anything coming out of the exhaust. The more frustrating problem is just how wide this exhaust makes that bike. On a lot of premium adventure bikes, which also have an upslung exhaust, or dirt bikes, they tend to have a monoshock, and then they can push the exhaust a bit under the frame. They also do some trickery by using a tall but narrow exhaust. Aveta have done none of this, so now this bike is really wide, making it really difficult to fit any luggage racks. I know that some people suggested to just mount the left pannier a bit more inboard, but you're still quite wide on the right side, and because it is going out so far, the leverage effect that you've got on pulling the bike to one side makes it a bit more tricky. And as I said, now we have different lengths. Maybe it's something to be refined by the next owner, I guess. Maybe even with that exhaust pulled down, because with the low air intake, there's no point in having a high-slung exhaust anyway. A common oversight that modders often do is the heat shield on the exhaust, and this exhaust, oh my god, does it pour a lot of heat up from here, I don't know what this is. It may be some form of catalytic converter, because it stinks like a 1970s bike. But the heat shield on here, for some reason, somebody thought of putting on a gap in here, which is exactly where your foot is when you're standing up straight from the seat. So if it smells like barbecue when you're standing up, check your knees. So now that I've touched on the exhaust and a couple items on the engine, what does it feel like overall? And my baseline is my Wave, which, considering it's such a cheap bike, feels so refined compared to this in terms of vibration, power output, how it goes to the rev range. Even the gear shifter on it feels so much lighter than this. You have to properly stomp on this thing, but it's okay, it's fine. But considering its lack of emissions controls and its carburetor, I'm surprised about the low power output. As I said, it feels like a 110cc Wave that I used to have. It's a similar story with the fuel economy. At an average 2.6 liters per 100, it could be so much worse, since this bike still uses an old-fashioned carburetor and it's revving its nuts off when cruising. But it's a lot better than the old CT110 or the CB125E, which drank about 3 liters per 100 while carrying a heavier load. However, my Wave has been getting about 2 liters per 100, so if they had just done something, could have been better. But hey, could be worse. A huge plus, and I cannot stress this enough, is this big fuel tank. Look at it. According to the specs, it's 8.5 liters. We've used it down to about 6 liters with 2 liters left. It's a bit hard to judge with that fuel gauge, which is just as accurate as the odometer. Another plus over a Wave, and it's got it in common with the CT series, is that you can fill up the tank without having to take the luggage off your passenger seat. However, how to open the seat is kind of interesting. So if I now close it, you could either take the key and try to fondle with that lock down there, or you just go to the other side and completely don't use any key and just push on that lever down here and bonk, the seat comes up. And now that we've touched on the seat, quite literally, if you're in the KL area, I do recommend a quick visit to a place called Has Cushion. They can reshape it for you to make this already quite comfortable seat even more comfortable. This guy is just magic. However, what I don't recommend is that stitching on here. Yes, it's lovely, it's pretty. We thought it was a good idea. However, what you end up with is a lot of holes in the fabric. So if it rains, water will come through and it will settle in the foam below. And if you now hop on the bike after the rain, you know where that water is going. The next part of handling are the wheels. And here I have to say, I have to take off my hat again to the Aveta engineers, because they've done a pretty good job. So in the rear, we have a 16-inch rim with an Imperial 400 size tire with a really decent sidewall and some good amount of width to give you some extra traction on boggy surfaces. In the front, we're running an 18-inch rim with a 2.5-inch tire. That'll certainly help with rolling over obstacles and the like. And putting a little bit extra onto these tires, usually I don't care too much about factory-equipped wear items, which tires are. But I'll have to say to Aveta, again, hats off. Those, I think, Chinese tires that I put on, they're actually not bad. They grip okay on dirt and on sealed roads as well. Certainly much better than the V-rubber knobbies that I used to run on my Wave. The brakes are pretty good as well. It's got a relatively large front disc brake, which should have no issues of dissipating heat on this small bike. They did take a while to bed in, but once they did, they actually brake pretty good now. The rear is running an old-fashioned mechanical drum brake. They're fine. They actually brake harder than a lot of disc brakes you find in the back. The only downside on them is they are much more prone to overheating, but it's the rear brake. You've got 70% of braking in the front, which you should be using on straights anyway. Owners of small Hondas will now sympathize with me, because all of them complain about how short-lived their chains are. On this bike, Aveta have actually been pretty decent. They fitted a 428 chain. I think it is from factory. It's so far, this is the sum total of all the stretch it has done in 5,000 kilometers. I haven't tightened it yet. I'll have to do that when I get home tonight. Connecting the wheels to the rest of the bike is the suspension, and I think they must have looked at enduro bikes and people who are doing stunts and flying with them, because these shocks, they're lovely gas shocks. They are really hard, even with the lowest preload setting. So if you're going over minor bumps, it's a little bit of a jarring experience. The front is similarly hard as well, since we've had it done at the guy who fixed that Death Wobble. Now, mods, that's what the actual Aveta owners are looking for, and they ended up being a bit different to what I expected I'd be putting on. And I'll start with the first one we put on, and that's the phone holder. Usually we use a RAM mount quick grip, which you push your phone in and it comes out. And This time my partner tried a motor wool thing, which is meant to be waterproof, which is a nice idea, great, but that cover on the top is so reflective you can't see your phone, so it's better if you're using Bluetooth headphones, because this thing here makes it a bit difficult to wire a cable in, and it makes it a bit difficult to use the charger to charge your phone. A good pannier rack is hard to find even on a popular motorbike. So good luck to anyone finding anything for this. I'll try to keep it brief, as I don't think too many people would install a rack on this bike anyway. The design I've got on here is not exactly something I'm proud of, as the features on it go against some of my own advice. My excuse being the exhaust design, and simply that we didn't have much time to muck around and experiment with it in a nice workshop. We had this built by a welding workshop for cars in the north of KL, and it's an experience that reminded me of the issues that you just run into when you're getting anything made in Asia, where things can easily get lost in translation, or they will implement a thing you exactly told them not to do, or they will just take shortcuts, so it's an experience. The design was based off racks that I have made for my CB500X and the Wave, using tubular steel to reduce the risk of injury in a fall. It's braced for some extra strength through the center in the back and is mounted onto the handles at the top and at the bottom. It's relatively straightforward, really. On it we carried my old Nelson Rig 3050 panniers, which I still think are really good. I used them on my Wave and 500X and only recently replaced them with the newer 4050s, which are just a little bit more refined and bigger. Something I didn't expect to modify on this motorbike is the center stand. This arm was mounted onto that tube, was so weak that thing just bent like a wet noodle when I tried to lift this bike up with a bit of luggage installed. So a quick visit to a motorbike mechanic with a welder in Koh Lanta, 300 baht later, and we've got a brace on here and that problem is now gone. That thing is strong now. As I've mentioned, this is one of the first bikes I've come across which has got a really decent headlight. We, on top of that, still fitted these spotlights, which are nice because they make you so much more visible when you're riding around in broad daylight with big traffic. It's not too blinding with those yellow lenses on. And at nighttime, it's wow, you're outshining four-wheel drives. It's amazing. They are wired straight into the lighting circuit of this motorbike, which uses the same positive ground half-wave AC like you find on Honda Waves. They also have these flashing patterns that are very popular in Southeast Asia. We found it actually more of a nuisance because it comes on when you don't want it, either because the revs have dropped a little bit too much or because you toggled them a bit too quickly. At least I have the use in indicating that something is wrong, because even though this bike does have hazard lights, the indicators in the front are so dim that you can barely see them. Another mod I didn't expect to do is to literally turn this into part CT125 by adding a Honda CT125 mud flap on here. It's in an attempt to reduce this bike's habit of just showering you in lovely dirty road water whenever you're going over a wet road because of this big gap on here. A mod that I have seen on a lot of Thai bikes that I also didn't expect I would put on is a genuine tuk-tuk mud flap, so it can pretend to be a three-wheeler. And same story as well, this part on here, on that fender, is narrower than the tires, so it just shoots water up through the back on here onto all of your luggage, and if there's no luggage, onto your back. And it also sprays through here quite a bit as well, so this should reduce that a little bit. I know I've ragged on this bike quite a lot, but you know what, at the end, once you sort out its little foibles, it's actually a pretty decent machine. It's awesome to just bomb around on trails or do some local riding. I don't think I'd recommend using it as a long-distance tourer just because of that part availability. But if you want to have it as a second bike, or if you're not going too far, you're staying in Malaysia, you know what? It's actually not a bad choice.